coordinator here with Project Humanities. Rachel is a fairly recent graduate of Arizona State University with a BA in Religious Studies and Global Studies, and plans to pursue a PhD studying pedagogies of global interfaith justice initiatives, specifically those operating in the context of religious nationalisms and conservative culture wars. So feel free to make comments in the chat. The team will be monitoring those, and we are passing the ball over to Ben and Rachel. So thank you both for accepting our invitation to lead this conversation.
Thank you for having us. Well, great to see you this evening, Ben. So I think let's go ahead and just get started. So to begin with all of us, we're basing today's podcast program on a podcast that was an interview with Angela Chen. And she wrote a recent book about asexuality and kind of what asexuality says about our society itself. Ben and I have talked, and we decided that the basis for this conversation is going to be a little more like filling in the blanks of kind of stuff that we wish was kind of parsed out a little more into that. And personally, I'm going to be talking from my own personal experiences as somebody who is asexual. And then Ben will be coming to this as somebody who has done research on this and research on the way that, our epistemologies or the ways we think about things goes against asexuality and things like that. So Ben, you could probably introduce yourself and how you like to bring yourself into this, or describe your research just quickly before we get started. I'll open the floor to you for that.
Sure thing. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so I approach research with asexuality from a communication perspective. And so I'm looking at messages basically and how messages affect us, our identity, our health, our relationships, and things like that. And I usually do this through what's called a critical cultural view. So I'm always looking at how is unjust power influencing us, our messages, and all of that.
Perfect. Thank you. So we're going to get started. We've already gotten started, but let's go into first what we consider basic definitions of asexuality. I know that you and I have different ones. Mine is very generalist, whereas yours, I think, gets to the meat of a lot of stuff. So when I explain asexuality to my friends or my family members, all I really say is asexuality is, an orientation where somebody does not experience sexual attraction. And so there are different forms of attraction, but explicitly not sexual. So mine is a little more absence-based, but I know, Ben, what would you expand on that with?
Yeah, I think that's a great entry point. Today, asexuality as a term is more of a macro identity. And then under that kind of umbrella or spectrum are a bunch of micro identities that all involve little to no or conditional feelings or attractions or sexual attraction. And I think, I don't know if you want to go into this now, Rachel, but I think really important when we talk about defining asexuality is how it's different from things like libido, chastity, and celibacy.
Yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, I guess I can start with chastity and celibacy. So those are just messages that we're taught through our cultures. A lot of time religious cultures will teach us to be chaste, or which is these rules around sexual action or thoughts even. And it's usually in the form of no premarital sex or something like that, or no extramarital sex. And celibacy is when one declares himself to not have sex, usually for religious or cultural reasons. Those are very different from, as you said, asexuality, which is how someone is oriented in space and time in terms of their attraction.
Right, that's a common misconception that I hear a lot and that I've even experienced is this idea that all asexuals do not have sex, or that celibacy component. It's like if you're asexual, you must be somebody who is philosophically like celibate or something like that, and that's not necessarily the case. It's also very interesting because I think that also when we think of asexuality, people also often conflate it with libido. So the idea of not desiring to have sex at all. And it's so we're getting into this part where now I'm realizing we should probably identify that, this is a conversation between adults. And when you talk about asexuality, you're going to have to talk about sex and sexual feelings a little bit. And so, so the idea, so we'll just to our audience members, like, let's all just be adults here and stuff like that. But the libido is like the idea of craving sex or wanting sex, and not necessarily all asexuals have low libido. In fact, some asexuals do experience sexual desire. Some of them pursue that sexual desire with intimate partner interactions, or maybe just with themselves to satisfy those desires. So I think that one of the things you've said in your definition, Ben, is that asexuality is this kind of like macro identity umbrella, and then there are micro identities underneath it, right, that cover all of those different kind of spectrums of experiences. And so I could probably pull up a graphic to show that really quickly, but in the meantime, Ben, is there anything you'd like to clarify with what I just said?
No, let's go ahead and see that graphic. Curious.
And while Rachel is pulling up the graphic, I want to thank you, Rachel, for adding that advisory, because I can see headlines now. Project Humanity is having a conversation about sex, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. What we are putting it in the context of the other critical conversations that we've had when we talked about aging and LGBTQ, when we talk about two spirits. This is a conversation, however, that is fundamentally about sex. And so we just want to make sure that people understand that we're not doing it for spectacle. We're doing it because it's part of a critical conversation that we are not just starting tonight. We're just adding more to what we have done in the past. Did that give you enough time to bring it up, Rachel?
Sorry, it did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see yours. Well, there we go. If you put that kind of, it's a little cut off on the right, but we get the gist of it. Yes.
You get the gist of it. Cool.
Yes, there we go. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So these are a bunch of different ones. And again, this isn't meant to be like, some of these are like very specific. Some of these are very general. This isn't the end all be all of all these micro identities. It's just helpful. So the ones you commonly see when it comes to asexuality, you hear demisexual thrown a lot, and that's somebody who experiences sexual attraction to somebody after they have more of an emotional bond formed with them. So they don't have immediate sexual attraction, or at least that's my understanding of it. I don't want to speak for other experiences. We also commonly hear this idea of gray asexuality, which is only rarely experiencing sexual attraction under certain circumstances, or you experience sexual attraction without the desire to act on it. And then there's a bunch of other ones underneath it. Ace flux is one that I hear a lot, which is your sexuality fluctuates between asexual and allosexual. And again, that isn't necessarily always connected to libido. So that is more complicated. And yeah, those are probably the ones that I hear the most. I also hear sex repulsed, sex neutral, and those are kind of ones where it's like sex repulsed is you are repulsed by the idea of sex and having it, whereas sex neutral is I don't necessarily desire to partake in sex, but I don't have any like feelings of disgust or anything towards it. I also don't feel any desire towards it. And then, there are also experiences of sex positive asexuals where they have positive experiences with sex and have positive views on it, but they don't necessarily orient to it or crave it. So that's the spectrum of experiences that I've seen in like asexual spaces and amongst like conversations that I've had. I'm not interested in sharing where I fit on that spectrum, but I am an asexual married woman. And so things do get a little hairy sometimes. So that's kind of the micro identities that I see there. And so one common thing I see with all the people who are in this micro identity is there seems like there's this shared frustration with the socialization of allosexuality, and that our world is very allonormative. And so, Ben, I was wondering if you can go into more about why is it that asexuality is a topic that isn't received like very common, isn't brought up commonly, isn't received well. People think it's fake. Or what is this kind of weight of allosexual normativity, and what does that word even mean?
Right. So, in its simplest way, if someone is not asexual, they are allosexual or allosexual, meaning they experience attraction, whatever that looks like. And allonormativity or alonormativity then is the structures in place, the systems in our cultures and our lives that have made being allosexual normal. And it even has created privilege and things like that, which is to say, I need to clarify something here. There's nothing wrong with being allosexual. Where we have issues is when folks who are not allosexual feel othered, are discriminated against, and are victims of violence. And so allonormativity makes it normal or normative to be allosexual. And where this comes from is a big question. You could look at it, some folks point to like a biological perspective, maybe through like the theory of evolution by natural selection, that the whole point of species is to propagate the genes, right? So we have to have sex so our genes can pass down. There's like social cultural reasons here. Like Michel Foucault, a philosopher, talks about how the whole family is at the center of a cultural group. And so to be an anchor into the community is to have children, and to teach your children to have children, and so on. And obviously that implicates with asexuality, because some ace folks don't want to have kids and some of them do. So that's where it comes from. And of course, when we're talking about big structures or systems of allonormativity, we have to think about it in conjunction or in like intersections with other forms of injustice or unjust power or hegemony, like racism, colonialism, other forms of queer phobia, and things like that.
Perfect. I think that's a great introduction into that. So I'm wondering, where do you see gender disparity, in this conversation? Like, I'm wondering how this, and I don't want to get too into the weeds, right? But how do we see like this conversation on allonormativity as something that does intersect a little more with gender lines, racial lines, class lines, or coloniality? That was something we talked about in our pre-session, and I thought that it would be kind of good just to like press into that a little more, especially the colonial part of it. I think is very interesting.
Sure. So the colonial structures, and in the case of the United States, this is the settler coloniality and other mechanisms that uphold the violent and genocidal settler colonialism of usually white European Christians, was that not only is it the violent theft of land and resources and water, but it is also a mandate to abandon indigenous ways of knowing, ways of life. And we know that many indigenous cultures, as I'm sure you've talked about before, embrace more of these queer identities and things like that. But in the broadest sense, asexuality challenges the colonialism in that it's this structure of what relationships and kin looks like, right? We're supposed to be cisgender, heterosexual, and we're supposed to have children, on and on. So to me, that's where it all kind of comes together in terms of colonialism, and in terms of other forms of racism, because anti-Blackness is a big part of this conversation. We can see this with like the trope of the mammy in a lot of literature. There's a scholar named Owen, and she did a really important piece on an essay that kind of traced how asexual violence is connected with Black cisgender women to the trope of the mammy, that is a Black woman who is asexual to take care of the white children. And so in that case, asexuality is thrown onto somebody, is ascribed onto them instead of it being how they self-identify or about asexuality. So that's a big way it intersects with racism. And then we see other ways, like in some Latin cultures, this idea of like Marian mismo or family mismo that like really put a lot of pressure onto Latin women in particular to be sexual and to have children. And I guess that kind of segues into the other part that you talked about, gender lines. Depending on the culture, a lot of women are pressured into motherhood. They are coerced, maybe coaxed, merely in a lot of ways, just because the culture has these messages that, oh, you're a woman, you're going to grow up and be a mom one day. And so that can influence ace folks who don't want that.
Yeah.
To another end, like for cis men in some cultures, it's expected that they be super hypersexual, right? If they're not having sex with a lot of different folks, then something's wrong with them. So in terms of that, yeah, it's also kind of an important thing. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of research at all for non-binary, trans, intersex, and otherwise gender non-conforming folks. So that is a gap that we really need to address.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, that's, I really like, I mean, I loved everything that she said. I think it's also really interesting and important when she mentioned about asexuality being thrown on to certain populations. I think that, I mean, Dr. Lester talks a lot about the racial representation of the mammy and things like that. And I definitely can see where that asexual component might be there. On top of that, you know, this idea, it's interesting. That also just got me thinking about like the ways that you're talking about how asexuality it's kind of thrown onto genders very differently too, because what I know that I've seen is like you said, on one end of the spectrum you have men or people who are male presenting who are expected to be hypersexual, but it's a very interesting paradox that I think women face, or especially in religious environments, where it's like there's this paradox of like chastity slash allosexuality, where it's you're supposed to be asexual, as in, you know, the woman is supposed to not have sexual desires or have sexual agency, but at the same time have multiple kids. So that's a very interesting dynamic as well that I was kind of thinking of while you were talking.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you'll notice, and kind of what you're bringing up, and some folks in the chat are bringing up, is kind of how alonormativity operates, fluctuates as a paradox. It's like two opposites, and somehow it's connected. But this is how hegemonic unjust power always is. It has to change over time in order to stay in control. And so, yeah, you get the a Black woman being a mammy and at the same time hypersexual or things like that. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's all paradoxical, and which makes it difficult to trace from a research perspective. But important because it helps us understand, kind of like we were talking about, it helps us understand sexism and queerphobia and racism and colonialism in other ways.
Right. A lot of stuff going on right now about that paradoxical nature of sexuality in general, which yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why we don't want to talk about asexuality, because a lot of this kind of gunk in the way that we as a society kind of approach sex in general kind of has to come up once we start talking about asexuality, right? The paradoxes and the, you know, the stereotypes or the boxes and whatnot. So I'm really glad that you went into that. So there's another thing that I wanted to go into this, and our chat is also very nicely segueing into it, which is we've talked about how asexuality is kind of projected onto people, how allosexuality is projected onto people. And now I'm kind of interested in us talking about like what is going on like within asexual communities, like what are the conversations that are being had, and kind of like what are the like identity things that are going on there. One of the conversations, for example, that I'm hearing a lot of is the place of asexuals in the queer community, in the two-spirit LGBTQIA plus community. Now, we say that A means ally. We also say that it means asexual. And I think that people are pretty straightforward on like, okay, that includes asexuals. What I hear a lot of contention on is whether or not asexuals, and I'm speaking from, I've been a part of many conversations where I've heard people who identify as asexual kind of debating whether or not asexual is something that falls on the queer spectrum. And so, for example, there are a couple of arguments that I've heard going different ways. One is that people don't like the word queer at all, and so they don't call themselves that. That's definitely there. And then there's, people saying, I do feel like I fit under this umbrella because I am not cis, because I am not heterosexual, and I'm not allosexual, and I don't follow these norms. And excuse me, I said I'm not heterosexual, and that's actually, being hetero is not, I misspoke. You can be asexual and still heteroromantic. The argument I hear is that people are saying, I'm asexual and therefore I'm not what the society considers as the norm for sexual and romantic relationships, and therefore that's why I see myself as queer. And then other people are saying, well, I don't know if it's my place to be identifying as queer or identifying as a part of Pride, because I don't really see where I face oppression in the way that people who are homosexual or trans or pansexual, with different gender identities or different sexual identities experience oppression. And so I'm wondering, I have some comments on this, but I'm talking a lot. So Ben, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on like these different things. And if you've heard this debate on asexuality and queerness from a communication lens, like debated, or just in general, what are your thoughts on that kind of idea?
Right. I feel this is important to talk about because it gets what at the core to me is it gets at belonging. And we know that most human beings, with rare exception, need to feel like we belong. And so when we don't, there's a lot, it can cause a lot of harm. And so, yeah, this debate is current, it's ongoing. I'm thinking, so for one research project I did recently, I interviewed 20 folks who are along the asexual spectrum, and I asked them about this in terms of, do they feel like they belong to the queer community or not? And I got mixed responses. And I also had folks bring up how they were mistreated by asexual queer folks. And so, yeah, it's difficult. I think what's important at the core of it is what communities of care do we want to create? And a big part of creating community is through communication. So that's kind of where that comes in. But of course, it's more than that. It's relationships, it's the material needs that we have and things like that. So yeah, how are we taking care of each other, basically?
Yeah, and I think that, what you're also, when you're talking about care, is what I think of. I often think from a deficit perspective, and that's my fault. But I'm thinking of, like, for example, like when we grouping asexuals with other queer folks is kind of necessitating that care and saying that there is a need for care. And that also means that there is a lack of safety in many contexts. And so what I think about too, when you talk about care or you talk about community, is I guess this tendency to overlook as well the issues that are very unique that asexuals face. It's not just that pressure of the allosexual socialization, but with many, but with a few people that I know personally, and anecdotal, stories. To me, it seems like sexual violence against asexual people is actually quite common. And I don't know if there's any, research to support that. Last time I checked, there wasn't much, but when it comes to anecdotally, like, I've heard a lot of instances of sexual violence or violence in general against people who are asexual.
Yeah, unfortunately. And it's just horrible, and obviously that should happen to no one ever. But this is why alonormativity is something that's violent, and must be challenged and stopped. So we I think a huge issue though is the history of asexuality is kind of parallel to the history of gayness, in that it was pathologized by medical professionals at first, and still today. The DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual, it's how mental health care professionals diagnose mental illness, still has things like what's called the hyposexual disorder, so which can conflate with aceness. In other words, we treat asexual folks as if they're broken or ill, and that's not good. And that's just one side of it. Also, yeah, domestic sexual violence is also a huge issue for queer folks in general. So we could see this, like, for example, if you're a homoromantic asexual, meaning that you experience a romantic attraction to someone of the same gender, of your own gender, but you are asexual, they may have experienced violence on trying to be treated to stop them from being homoromantic, right? We know this awful history of conversion therapy and things like that for folks who are attracted to their own gender. And we also know that conversion therapy happens for ace folks still today. And it's a violent thing to happen, and it has to stop. And I think that a large part of this, something that we kind of glossed over, was how and I'm thinking of this because I saw it in the chat. It's how religious culture kind of feeds into this, or religious expectations, doctrines, policies. In a lot of world religions kind of expect heterosexual marriage that leads to childbearing. And so, which is fine, but it's also not fine if you're going to force and coerce and make people feel evil or sinful for not doing that. and especially to enact violence against folks like that is very bad.
Right, thank you. Something else that I see that we glossed over in the chat is recognizing that you can be asexual and so for example, being asexual, you said it also, I'm building off of what you said, can be asexual and homoromantic, asexual and panromantic, biromantic. You can be asexual and lesbian, you can be asexual and transgender, asexual and intersex, asexual and non-binary. I'm not going to be able to list all the things you can be asexual and, but it's important because I think that this was something, you know, one of the reasons why it took me so long to grapple with the fact that with my aceness is because I was like, well, I can't be asexual if I also am attracted to both genders. Like, how can I say I'm asexual and bisexual? Because like bi has sexual in it, but there's not bi without sexual, which then I learned it's pretty easy. You're just biromantic, which I didn't even know that existed. And so I think that that's, yeah, I'm really glad, Leora, that you mentioned that in your comment, that is true. That is important to press into. I'd also just like to, well, just in general, if Ben, you don't have any other like stuff that you think is like base level, I think now would be a good time to maybe go into like audience Q&A, because I know there's a lot of questions when it comes to asexuality and things like that. So you can certainly jump in at whatever places that you feel comfortable or have expertise. I'm personally comfortable just talking from an experiential lens. I don't necessarily have the research and knowledge to talk about things from like I don't want to say from an educated perspective. I'm just kind of self-depreciating right now. But yeah, Ben, are there any questions like Q&A style that you'd be interested, maybe more about how asexuality is communicated or?
I will hop in wherever I can be helpful.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Rachel,
All right.
and then I want to offer a question based on the podcast. And part of that came from the author who talked about their different partners. And I kind of wonder about that when one is talking about one's sexual identity and one is partnered, to talk about that somehow speaks to the partner also on some level. So how does that, I mean, people negotiate it all the time, but it does seem to go with this privilege about partnering, but also the ways in which to tell our story is not just to tell our story, it's to also tell the stories of those with whom we are partnered on some level. So maybe you could address that.
Yeah, I'll take that. And so I'll start with a little anecdote, which is I first realized, like, came to the idea that I was asexual when I was 14. And one of the things that kind of kept me so dark in the closet was this immense fear that I would never be able to find a partner. Because like we've talked about, you know, allonormativity is like a really huge thing, but also how is anybody going to love me if I won't have sex with them? And so, you know, that's I think a very valid challenge that some people face in the dating scene. I actually came out to my partner while we were already together. And so, yeah, I think from my personal experience, it's very interesting because we're a straight presenting couple. But when it comes to like how our relationship operates, we are very much a queer couple. And I think that, you know, how do I answer this? I think that with what you're asking, Dr. Lester, this also brings up, I think one of the reasons why sexual violence is something that's really common towards people who are asexual. I know that I experienced a lot of intimate partner violence because there was this, you know, this idea of consent, you know, and coming to agreements and negotiating with stuff with partners. And so it is very difficult to find a relationship or where, you know, you feel safe and where you feel respected. And I think that that is something that's, you know, central to any relationship. But I think that that's kind of a challenge that's there, is being in something where you've come to an agreement with someone and you have to be honest. You have to be honest with your needs. To some people, sex is very important in a relationship. It is important emotionally, it is important spiritually, it is important in all these ways that are, you know, untangible to me because it's not important to me. And so if somebody is like that, maybe, and you're sex repulsed or something like that, then maybe that might not necessarily be a good match. But on the other hand, there are people who are, you know, sex favorable or sex neutral. And so that is a component of the relationship. So I don't know if that answered your question right. And I apologize to
It
anybody in
does.
the
No, it
chat.
does. And this wasn't to pry in anybody's
No,
personal
no, no.
life,
I think, no,
but
no,
it
no,
was,
no.
you know, when I mean, there's this assumption which goes back to your mainstream sort of ideas that when one said I'm partnered, then there's this narrative that is often created with these other kinds of expectations. But we also know that these relationships and sexual identities are very performative, and so there's a way in which how you're actually thinking may never manifest in what you're actually doing.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think a way to kind of put this cleanly is that just because one is asexual doesn't mean their partner has to be asexual.
Right.
You know, there is that diversity in relationships there.
The podcast does bring that out too. So
Yes, it does.
very good. Yes. Right.
Perfect. And just when you said that too, Dr. Lester, I only brought up the anecdote because I remember when I came out to the office, I remember a couple of days later, you were like, well, the reason why I didn't react to it initially is because you weren't just telling me something about you were telling me something about your relationship and your partner, which I think is valid. It does show like there's a complex aspect to like
Yes.
to that partnering and stuff like
Right.
that. I don't mean to.
No. That
Yeah.
These, just so that people know, these are how these events come about, because
Literally.
we have an office where we literally meet in the hall or on Zoom and we talk about this, and we're like, oh, we should do a program on this. And I had always been curious when you self-identified as queer, and I was like, okay, now where is she on that spectrum? This doesn't kind of align with my allosexual narrative. So thank you for clarifying that, and I will pass it on to somebody else. Okay.
Anybody else have a point they'd like to bring up or something like that? I
will ask, Mormonism is part of Ben's research as well. What's the connection between those, or is there a connection that you're able to identify?
Mormonism is a religion that mandates cisgender heteronormativity. It's also very alonormative in the sense that they have congregations that are singles only, with the goal for Mormons to marry each other within the church. That's kind of like a social cultural thing, but at a very deep doctrinal level, Mormons believe that one must be heterosexually married in order to gain entrance, I suppose, into the highest level of heaven. In other words, aces who do not want to marry are not allowed in the Mormon heaven. And so this is it's pretty influential. Catholicism has a lot of the cultural messages too. It's not quite doctrinal, but a lot of Catholicism teaches that same too, that thing as well, right? That family is important. You need to get married, have children, and things like that.
Okay. Well, I say that because we have at least one ex-Mormon on the in the chat. Hi, Aaron. When we mentioned this to Aaron was very excited to bring some of his no, I don't even know if that's the right term for that, but the fact that you research Mormonism as well, I wondered if there were connections between those.
And as somebody who does, study of religion, I mean, these norms to have family and things like that are prevalent in many different religions. what's very interesting is I grew up Catholic, and I remember like very pointedly, like as I was like, um, grappling with my aceness and things like that, I was like, oh, well, I guess I'm just supposed to be a nun, and that's why I am this way. So that's a joke I make all the time. Is like, I used to think I was supposed to be a nun, but it turns out I'm just asexual. So yeah, I mean, there is kind of that. It's interesting where those categories kind of like form. I think that Catholicism isn't the only religion. I mean, I've seen this, for example, in South Asian religious systems. There's this concept of like asceticism, which is like not having any earthly desires, and asexuality in a way is part of that. But again, that's kind of the way we inflict that allosexual normativity onto people, right? Like if you're asexual, or if somebody is experiencing that lack of sexual attraction, it's almost tied to like not being fully present, like in reality. So I just like to kind of poke that in there, that it's not just Christianity. Many different religions, even Islam, like talk about this need to have a family, and a large one. So I apologize if I kind of gloss over some big theological concepts, but just wanted to point in there it's not just Christianity.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And allonormativity appears to be one of it appears to be kind of a global phenomenon. And that's coming from someone, like I said, I'm kind of trained in the critical cultural tradition, and there's not a lot of global, truths out there. And for allonormativity to be something, in my mind, is pretty darn close to being a global truth. It speaks to how ubiquitous it is. It speaks to the power that it wields in our lives, for religious folks, for non-religious, and everyone in between.
Yeah, one of the things I just really wish about, the way that um, we socialize, people in terms of sexuality, and just, I especially think of like ace kids growing up and things like that. Um, when I imagine a future like without allonormativity or something, I imagine this future where people are able to explore, you know, people are able to explore their aceness. And because I feel like asexuality, like you're not allowed to be a sexual being, or you're not allowed to experiment or talk about your feelings or anything like that as a youth, it's almost as if, one doesn't realize that they're asexual until like they're allowed to be sexual, and they realize that they don't have that. And I think we talked about this before, you and I, Ben, where a lot of asexuals actually come out when they're in their 20s or 30s, because as younger people, it's like, well, this is normal. I'm not supposed to be interested in any of this because it's bad, it's sinful, I'll get pregnant and die, to quote Mean Girls. So so yeah, there's that late coming out. I remember we talked about that. Do you have any comments on it? Or
Um, yeah. Um, so research says that the average age of coming out is about 12 to 14, and we that's for alo queer folks, and we know that asexual coming out, self-disclosure, coming to, is much older than that. And I think that's because of the ubiquitous, like the ever presence of allonormativity, and uh, I think it's also kind of speaks, when I say like it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. I mean, you got to think of it as even like, gay folks are having sex, are thusly engaging in allosexual interactions and things like that. So it's bigger, it's a more ubiquitous structure than even, homonormativity or heteronormativity or cisnormativity in that sense. So yeah, it's going to have an impact on our identities, how we understand ourselves, how we understand each other, how we show care for one another and care for ourselves.
I mean, it's a huge thing to have to dismantle is allonormativity. I mean, and the idea that, so the idea that like the concept of allonormativity is so new. I mean, even me as somebody who, I almost said it like a religion of practicing asexual. So even as me, as somebody who follows into that identity, and I have been in that identity for 10 years, I've never heard of allonormativity. I didn't even know what allosexual was until I think Jocelyn in one of our pre-conversations asked about it, and you told her. So this is just, it just reminds me again, like one of the reasons, if we're not talking about it, that's because there's an institution of power that benefits from it. And so definitely seeing that with allonormativity. So I'm looking again at kind of what's going on in the chat here. And I'm wondering if there's anything, Ben, that's sticking out to you. I'm a slow reader, so I'm not going to be able to read until I stop talking. But any points here that look?
I wanted to step in while you guys look at the chat a little bit. I just wanted to mention, because Leora just pointed out something really interesting. When I was teaching high school 10 years ago, I noticed, okay, we're seeing this acceptance of homosexuality. I was teaching out on the west side of Phoenix, predominantly Latinx students, and we had a queer male student body president. Everybody loved this kid, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, that wouldn't have happened when I was in high school, right? So I felt like, oh, this is progress. And what I'm starting to realize is I think we got to a point where, or some of us have gotten to a point where simply being sexual and the idea like, oh, but you're getting some, and like there's an acceptance there of like, do you know what I'm saying? That like heterosexual people can sometimes accept homosexual people because it's like, well, now I understand you're just like me. It's just a different preference, but you still want sex, you still want love, you still want partnership, you still, the way that even during Pride, we, love is love. And it's like, yeah, I can understand you because you're still a couple that is just basically like me, just with different genitalia, right? But the idea of asexuality still seems foreign because we just think it's so innate and so quote unquote natural to want sex that we can't comprehend it in a way. Does that make sense?
I mean, I am just as confused about you as you are confused about me, Jocelyn.
Yeah. But that's like mind blowing, right? Because I've never had.
I was always like, yeah, love is love. Everyone loves each other. And I was like, well, people aren't talking about sex, so I guess no one cares about sex either. Nope, that's not what's going on. It's that paradox of allonormativity again at play. So yeah, but the idea that you're a couple just like me, there's another layer added to it where there's that lack of sexual connection. Yeah.
Well, and folks are going to look at the narratives that we create, whether you tell us or not. And those, at least that's my understanding of how people, I mean, whether it's about race, it's about this, or it's about that, there has to be a narrative that makes sense so that we can order the world or misorder the world. And so what's interesting about that is even if you said somebody is gay, then as Erin pointed out, there's certain assumptions that go with what that means. If you tease those out, that takes time though, to sort of critically think about that. Well, gay people don't do this, gay people don't do that. Some heterosexual people do this, some heterosexual people do that. And I remember, I think it was wasn't in the podcast also with the host saying something about, if you performed a certain act, does that mean that that's who you are? Was that in this podcast? The host said something to the author about,
yeah,
if you do this, then people are going to say that's who you are, but that's not really who you are because people have associated gay, for example, with certain kinds of, binaries of what that actually means and what that looks like. So it almost seemed, I posted that earlier about the Ashford and Simpson song, which is way too old for many of you, about ain't it a shame, can't give it a name, the moment you do, it flees from you. So I wonder if, on the one hand, the name gives it something that you can slip on, but does the name also somewhat limit and define? Is that possible? That it can do both of those things? It can be both liberating, but also confining when we name it, give it a label.
Yeah, I can share something. Yeah, I think so. I think it's a yes and a both and. In that project I had mentioned briefly, where I interviewed 20 folks along the asexual spectrum, I asked them, how do they self-identify, and how did they come to that term? And so there's a lot of power in words to like find that sense of belonging. And then, yeah, it's also a lot of limiting to folks. And so usually how they kind of approach that is like, well, this part of my identity is fluid. It's changing, like a lot of pieces of who we are fluid in that sense. And so, yeah, I would just say that there's so much power in words. And obviously I'm biased because I study communication, but I did just want to chime that in.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's power in words, and it's nice to feel affirmed in those words, but at the same time, there won't be a word for everything, and there won't be a word for every experience. I don't think there will ever be a word that perfectly encapsulates the way that I approach my life in terms of relationships and the way that I feel connections with people who I'm in a relationship with, if that makes sense. Like bi, romantic, asexual, it doesn't fit, but it's the closest thing to it, and that's what helps me navigate conversations with people.
Right.
So that's kind of what I come to it as.
I like that. So are there any burning things that we haven't addressed? I mean, I know that this is not, that's what's exciting about the podcast club, is that we whet the appetite based on something we've all listened to, or, well, in this case, listened to, and then we want to know more. And I saw lots of references in the chat, which we will be following up with and email to those who are able to attend and those who registered. Final thoughts on this topic before we move into our closing moments. Ben and Rachel.
I'll let you go first, Ben.
My closing thoughts are, I think I'm called back to that research project with 20 A-spectrum folks, and I asked them about kind of to reimagine what the world would be like without allonormativity. And a lot of them at the core was just taking care of one another in a way that sex isn't as centered as it is right now. And if you are allosexual, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is wrong to make you feel bad for not being allosexual. And so there's this euphoria that is, I think we can all tap into. Hopefully we can all tap into some sort of good feelings, even when we are experiencing discrimination or oppression. And to do that takes a lot of commitment and care to one another in a radical way. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Care without centering sexuality is a big thing. I have a lot of hope for a future that is radically affirming for all people, asexuals included. And I'm excited to see that we're talking about this today, and we're talking about this a lot more than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. This isn't something that's just happening on Reddit threads or Facebook groups or on Tumblr. And so I hope more conversations like this happen. And I hope that everyone listening, looks into this podcast if they haven't listened into it, and maybe look into resources learning more about asexuality. Because while we were able to talk about some stuff, there's there's no way we're going to be able to fit every little piece of it into 1 hour. So like Dr. Lester said, I hope it whets your taste. And yeah, thanks for coming, everyone.
Well, you both have done an excellent job of breaking this down and doing it with such authenticity and patience with those who are coming to this subject for the very first time. So we thank you both so much for spending time and helping us through this. And I think that it gives everybody something to think about, particularly if you're not in this arena doing this work. I know that several of you are, but I saw the questions. And so if it leaves us more curious, then our job is complete. I want you, those in the audience, to know that Project Humanities will continue these kinds of conversations on different topics over the coming weeks of the summer. This is sort of our podcast club project. I think we have one on, you'll have to help me remember, on homelessness and the unsheltered. We have another on reproductive rights. How relevant are both of those? And then there's a fourth one on something that I can't remember now.
Body neutrality.
Body neutrality, which is not to be confused, thank you, Jocelyn, with body positivity. So we keep our fingers at Project Humanities on the pulse of what's happening in the world, and we learn so much about it. If we don't know about it, we have a program about it, so we learn about it. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Stay tuned tonight, wherever you are. Stay tuned for the follow-up email. And is there a final slide that we need to remind people of? There we go. We've got some feedback forms that we really, as you sign out, please give us your feedback. We like to make these programs better. We also would invite you to sign the pledge. We posted it earlier in the chat, but it's tinyurl.com/human101 pledge. Again, it's only if you can see these conversations and their relevance in your life relative to compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect, and self-reflection. And I know for me, this conversation has hit many, if not all, of those principles. So like us on Facebook, follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed the program, learned anything from it, please tell somebody else about it. And as my friend David Hemfield says at the Black Theater Troupe, and if you didn't enjoy anything about it, just don't say anything to anybody. Thank you all very much. And if our team, any members of our Project Humanities team, interns, student workers could stay on the line so we can do our traditional shot, that would be great. Screenshot. Thank you all again.